The time for members' statements has concluded. It being 2 p.m, questions without notice. The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that since 2014 every one of the government's budgets have included cuts to the pension?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, as the member would know, the pension, along with all other index payments, increases twice a year in March and September. The budget has gone up every single year.
The member for Longman. Herbert, sorry. The member for Herbert.
Thank you,
Members
Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister inform the House about how a strong budget is enabling the Morrison government to keep Australians safe, protect our national security and defend our nation? Is the Prime Minister aware of the consequences of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Herbert for his question. Like all members of this House who have served their country in uniform, we say to them thank you for your service. Mr Speaker, just over 6 years ago, when this government was elected, we had some difficult issues and some difficult challenges. There were things that had to be turned around. There was the terrible failures of border protection that were menacing the country. There was a budget that we had inherited from the Labor Party that was in complete disrepair. There were emissions reduction profiles that meant we would not meet our Kyoto targets, would miss it by some 700 million tonnes. And of course there was the lowest level of defence spending as a share of GDP since before the Second World War, Mr Speaker. And so we had the challenge of turning all of this around, repairing the budget, getting the budget back into surplus, which it achieves this year, Mr Speaker, but at the same time ensuring that we're delivering on the essential services that Australians rely on. And we are now at record levels, Mr Speaker, of education and health spending, fully funding the NDIS, all of these important services being funded by a budget that is strengthening from year to year. Now, at the same time, we had to make up that massive gap when it came to dealing with the defence capability of this nation. Now, this is a turnaround that saw us set by 22-23 a target of 2% of GDP. Well, I can inform the House that we will achieve that in 2021. When the Treasurer comes to the dispatch box next year, Mr Speaker, he will be able to make it very clear that we will have met that target 3 years early to ensure that defence spending as a share of our economy is 2% of GDP. Now, that is in stark contrast. In Labor's last budget, Mr Speaker, they slashed defence spending by 10.5%. Mr Speaker, they slashed it by 10.5%. They ripped $18 billion out of the defence budget over the time of their management. And you know why they had to do it, Mr Speaker? They had to do it because they didn't know how to manage money. And when you run your budget into disrepair, when you can't keep the course of economic and fiscal management, Mr Speaker, then you can't get the budget back into surplus, you can't meet the needs and you can't ensure that you increase spending to 2% of GDP to ensure at a time when there are great threats, Mr Speaker, to Australia and around the world, when we have important responsibilities working with our allies and partners around the world to do our own heavy lifting as a result of the strong budget management of this government, Mr Speaker, we are in a position to say Australia carries its weight on defence, that we are meeting the obligations of our alliances, Mr Speaker, which keep this country safe. And we will continue to do that compared to the budget mismanagement of the opposition when they were in government, Mr Speaker, which led to the lowest defence spending since prior to the Second World War.
Has concluded, and I call the member for Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm how many pensioners will be negatively impacted by his legislation to cut the pension supplement?
The Minister for Social Security. Members on my left.
Well, I do thank the member for her question, and as the Prime Minister has said, pensions are regularly indexed, and indeed under this government the amount of money that goes to pensions, those on the age pension, has increased significantly since we've been in government. And our commitment Our commitment is to a sustainable social services system. Our commitment is to a sustainable social services system because under the previous government, under the previous Labor government, the challenge that we faced was that the social services system was not sustainable, Mr Speaker. The social services system was not sustainable, and we are determined to make sure that it is sustainable so that the rate of growth of social services spending is less than the rate of growth of tax revenue.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Sorry, I missed the member for Wills, the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, the question asks for the number of pensioners who would be negatively impacted by that legislation. Relevant comments such as 175,000 are not being made by the minister.
Yeah.
Has the minister concluded his answer? The minister's indicated he's concluded his answer. And I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's strong budget management is providing stability and certainty to regional Australia through infrastructure delivery, particularly in my electorate of Cowper?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. And 2 words in the member for Cowper's question: stability, certainty, and that's what the government, that's what the Liberal Nationals government is absolutely providing, Mr Speaker. And through the infrastructure $100 billion rollout over the next decade, that investment pipeline. And I know the member for Cowper is genuinely excited about this, Mr Speaker, because his people told him in regards to the Coffs bypass, Mr Speaker, that they wanted tunnels, and indeed, Mr Speaker, an environmental impact statement is already out there, and the community is having input into that process, Mr Speaker. This is, after all, the age of infrastructure. The Coffs Harbour bypass is getting people of the north coast of New South Wales, indeed all travellers up and down the length and breadth of the Pacific Highway, Mr Speaker, to where they need to be sooner and safer. The bypass, as the member for Cowper, he fought so hard for it. He fought so hard for it. We're delivering is going to have 4 lanes, tunnels, 14 kilometres in length, 12 sets of traffic lights avoided, Mr Speaker. And indeed, as the member for Cowper really well knows, Mr Speaker, it's creating 12,000 jobs. 12,000 jobs in the construction phase, Mr Speaker. The Pacific Highway is such a great project. It's one of the biggest projects we've got on the go at the moment, Mr Speaker, and certainly removing thousands of vehicles, especially heavy vehicles, from the central business district of Coffs Harbour. The member for Cowper said recently, when we visited his electorate to launch the EIS, this is not just a bypass. It's not just a road. What it's doing is providing, over the period of the build, some 12,000 direct and indirect jobs. Now, the money goes straight back into the local economy. It provides jobs in the local economy. And the Coffs Harbour Mayor, Denise Knight, is also very excited about this prospect. She said, "We're absolutely thrilled. It's going out to the community," that's the EIS, "so that everybody gets the opportunity to put in their 2 bobs worth." Now, let's remember that this study has been shaped by the people who will be using and benefiting from this bypass each and every day. Community consultation plays an integral role in ensuring we are truly delivering projects that the community wants, needs, expects and, perhaps most importantly, as the member for Cowper knows all too well, deserves. Let's talk about tunnels. The community called for tunnels to be built into the plans for the bypass, and we're delivering. The 3 tunnels will feature in the latest design of the bypass, which is what this EIS, and it's available, those EIS are available local pop-ups. There are little stalls in the Coffs Central Business District. They're available from Gurmeet Singh, the State Member's electorate office, from the member for Cowper's electorate office, and indeed on the RMS website, Mr Speaker. This is certainty and stability writ large, Mr Speaker. The Coffs Harbour bypass, we're getting on and we're building it for the benefit of Australia.
The member for Scullin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does this bill, the Social Services Legislation Amendment Payment Integrity Bill, which is in the House right now, make cuts to the pension supplement?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on both sides.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will ask the Minister representing the Minister for Social Services to add to my answer, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, what this government does. This government makes sure that the welfare system is fair to those who rely on it, and it's fair to those who pay for it, Mr. Speaker, which is the taxpayers of Australia. And where there are benefits and supplements to payments that are being paid to people who are having extended absences from Australia, so they're overseas for long periods of time, and they receive supplements to meet expenditures that people are facing at home, Mr. Speaker, not overseas, then the government will always seek to ensure that these supplements go to those for the purposes they are intended. Mr. Speaker, under our government, the welfare bill is not a blank cheque. Under our government, the welfare goes where it is needed and is targeted, and it is done in a sustainable way to ensure that all of those who rely absolutely on the welfare bill, Mr. Speaker, of this country can depend on it in the future. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? If you can't manage money, if you're a government that doesn't know how to manage money, you can't say to the pensioners of Australia that you can support their pension into the future. Under the Labor Party, they had to not list medicines, Mr. Speaker. They had to make cuts to defence. They even had to put a flood levy on, Mr. Speaker, because they did not know how to manage money. The Labor Party has to take responsibility for the implications, for the consequences, Mr. Speaker, of their failure to manage money. At the last election, we said very clearly, Labor can't manage money, and that means they come after yours. They will ensure, Mr. Speaker, through their mismanagement, that Australians miss out, that essential services that Australians rely on can never be guaranteed by the Labor Party, whether it's hospitals or schools or the NDIS or aged care, and they can bark and shout all they like, Mr. Speaker, but the truth is Labor can't manage money.
Was a bit late, member for Whitlam. You haven't got the call yet. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. As reluctant as I am to stop the Prime Minister telling us that pensioners are welfare recipients, I go to direct relevance. This was about the legislation that's before the Parliament. Does it cut the pension supplement?
Just say the members on my left. Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The member for Hunter. Can I just say all interjections are disorderly, but they're particularly disorderly if you're interrupting me when you've asked me to rule on a point of order. The Prime Minister was directly relevant to the specific question at the beginning of his answer. I think he's related his material, if not very broadly, to it so far. I still think he's in order. I remind members the standing order requires the Prime Minister and ministers to be directly relevant. It's not the standing order I think those on the opposition would want, which is directly answer the question, but it's directly relevant, and I think he's being directly relevant up until this point, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am asked about the pension, and I'll tell you what we won't do. We won't take away the imputation credits, Mr. Speaker, for pensioners who simply want to manage their own money, Mr. Speaker. At the last election, the Australian people know that Labor were coming after older Australians' money, and they said no to Labor.
The member for Bruce. The member for Indi has the call.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. It's been over 14 months since the Regions at the Ready report, a blueprint for regional development, was delivered to the government. The government then referred the report to an expert panel, which reported back within 6 weeks. That was 6 months ago. Regional Australia has now been waiting 2 years for the government to announce its plans for regional development. Can the Deputy Prime Minister please update the House about the findings of the expert panel and the government's timeline to implement the recommendations of the Regions at the Ready report?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Indi for her question. Mr. Speaker, each and every day each and every day the plans of this government for regional Australia are there for all to see. In the $100 billion infrastructure rollout that we are doing, the member indicates the regions at the Ready report, and I acknowledge the work done by her predecessor, Cathy McGowan, to that inquiry. I acknowledge also the then member for Murray, now member for Nichols, and other members for the input that they had into the regions of the Ready. Mr Speaker, my department is working very much on making sure that we get the final response, Mr Speaker, to that important report. And it is an important report, and I acknowledge the member's interest in it. She talks about a blueprint for regional Australia, and yes, on this side we do have a blueprint for the regions, Mr Speaker, which is more than I can say for those opposite, but the Liberals and Nationals, we continue to fight for a better deal for Australians who do not live in the capital cities, Mr Speaker. Those Australians who choose to invest in the regions, and as the Prime Minister knows, when the regions are strong, so too is our nation. Mr Speaker, as members may recall, and the member for Indi indicated, on 13 February the government tabled its response to the regions at the Ready investing in Australia's future. Now, in response to the report, the then Minister for Regional Services, Senator Bridget McKenzie, announced that a regional strategic growth expert panel, as the member indicated, would review the issues raised in regions at the Ready. Now, the panel delivered its final report in March. The government is incorporating the report's recommendations as part of our broader regional agenda. But in between all that process happening and now member for Indi, and I can inform the House we did have an election and we won, Mr Speaker, and now we're getting on. We're getting on with delivering even a better deal for regional Australia, because when we went to the election, those opposite, we won. We won. Member for Grainler, opposition leader, we won. And the regions, let me tell you, member for Grainler, they breathed a big sigh of relief. They breathed a big sigh of relief that we won the election, because they know that when it comes to getting on with regional deals, whether it's Barkly, Tennant Creek, whether it's Hinkler, or indeed whether it's Albury-Wodonga, where the member for Indi is particularly interested, Mr Speaker, we're getting on with those successful negotiations of rolling out better programs, rolling out better services, rolling out better infrastructure for those regional deals, and using those as pilots for what we could potentially do in other regional centres. I'll take the interjection from the member for Ballarat. I mean, when she was in charge of regional development, well, it was Ballarat at the time, because the ANAO, Mr Speaker, they were very harsh
Deputy
about
Prime
her
Minister,
delivery.
Deputy Prime Minister,
of her delivery of regional development. I withdraw. Of her rollout of regional development,
the
Mr.
Deputy
Speaker,
Prime Minister's
funding,
time has concluded. No, the caller is the member for Hunter seeking to table a document.
I'm asking the Deputy Prime Minister to table the notes from which he extensively read, in which he listed about 1,000 government committees.
The member for Hunter is entitled to ask the minister to table his notes, and it's my requirement to ask the minister whether he was reading from confidential material. And he assures me he was. So we'll go to the next question, which is the member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government's strong discipline provides stability and certainty to our economy? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
And I thank the member for Moore for his question. And he knows about the importance of a strong economy, with 70,000 taxpayers in the electorate of Moore benefiting from tax cuts that this side of the parliament supported and that those opposite called offensive and reckless, Mr Speaker. Now let's remind ourselves about the fiscal and financial mess that we inherited from the Labor Party. In the Labor Party's last budget, it was a budget deficit of $48.5 billion, Mr Speaker, around 3% of GDP. And in Labor's last year in office, 65,000 small businesses closed their doors, Mr Speaker. unemployment was at 5.7%, and, Mr Speaker, the 4 budget surpluses that Chairman Swan promised the Australian people never eventuated, even though Labor Party had an iron ore price of $185 a tonne, which is more than double of what it is today. Now, Mr Speaker, since we've come to government, we've helped create more than 1.4 million new jobs. We've got employment growth at 2.6%. We've helped maintain our AAA credit rating. The proportion of working-age Australians who are on welfare are at the lowest level of any government in 30 years, Mr Speaker. The real rate of spending growth of the government is now the lowest of any government in 50 years, Mr Speaker, and we are bringing the budget back into surplus for the first time in 12 years, Mr Speaker. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Now, we know that the Labor Party went to the Australian people at the last election with $387 billion of higher taxes. That would have taken the tax-to-GDP ratio to 25.9%, the highest tax-to-GDP ratio of any government in Australia's history, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party promised the Australian people. Now they have a 45% emissions target, which they couldn't understand, which they didn't explain to the Australian people, and which they refused to cost at the last election, Mr Speaker. And we know that the Labor Party have a hereditary addiction passed down from Chairman Swan to the member for Rankin to tax and spend, Mr Speaker. And we know the Labor Party promised surpluses, never delivered them, and we know on this side of the House we stand for more jobs, for lower taxes and for paying back Labor's debt.
The member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts. I refer to the text relay service CapTel, which is part of the National Relay Service, which helps senior Australians who are deaf to make and receive telephone calls. Why is the government removing access to the CapTel handset from the National Relay Service?
The Minister for Communications has the call.
Well, I do thank the Shadow Minister for her question. Of course, the National Relay Service is a very important communication service for Australians who are deaf or hearing impaired or have a speech impairment. And indeed, we have committed, we spend $22 million a year to deliver the National Relay Service so that people who have hearing impairment or speech difficulties are able to use the telephone system. Now, of course, it's very important that we are getting good value for money for taxpayers, and that's why we've recently gone through a competitive procurement process under which the incumbent, ACE, Australian Communications Exchange, had the opportunity to bid to retain the contract, and in the result they did not retain the contract. The contract has been awarded to a new company, Concentrix, and that will continue the National Relay Service commencing from the 1st of February 2020, and it follows a competitive selection process which is designed to get the best possible outcome for Australians who need to use the National Relay Service. And indeed, the Concentrix service will offer new options which are not available under the current arrangements, including, for example, the ability to receive texts over iPads, tablets and smartphones. Now, I want to make it very clear, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is technology agnostic about the services provided through the National Relay Service. At the moment, the position is that the owner of the existing proprietary CapTel system has cited an exclusive agreement and has declined to provide it. Should they be interested in providing it to maintain it for existing recipients of the CapTel service, of course we'd be very happy to speak to them about that. But I do want to make it absolutely clear there is no threat to the National Relay Service. The National Relay Service will be maintained, and there will continue to be the provision of technology. Indeed, there will be new technology options under which people who are hearing impaired or who are speech impaired can view text so that what is spoken by the person on the other end of the phone is converted into text which they will be able to view. So National Relay Service, very important, and the National Relay Service is continuing.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how the stability and certainty of the Morrison government's strong budget is strengthening Australia's domestic security infrastructure, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and thank him for his service to our country as well, and now in representing the members within his division of Stirling. Mr Speaker, when the Labor Party was in government, as we know, they spent billions of dollars in relation to—
Members on my left.
They spent billions of dollars on failed border policies. They put money into pink bats. They wasted billions and billions of dollars. And, Mr Speaker, it meant that they had to cut $128 million from the AFP. They cut $30 million and 88 staff from the ACC, $27 million and 56 staff from Austrac, and, Mr Speaker, $735 million and 700 staff from Customs, resulting in a 25% reduction in sea cargo screening and a 75% reduction in air cargo screening. Now, Mr Speaker, that's the one approach. That's the approach that Labor always brings to the table. The contrast to that approach is what this government has done since we've been in government since 2013, Mr Speaker. We've been able to restore integrity to the budget. We're returning to surplus, and we are putting additional money into the Home Affairs portfolio, and it's important to do so because we face threats in an unprecedented way. This year, we'll put $6.4 billion into the Home Affairs portfolio so that, Mr Speaker, we can keep our borders secure. We know that there are 70 million people in the world at the moment who are seeking asylum. We know that that includes 3 million people in the Indo-Pacific region alone, and so thoughts that we can soften our borders is completely ridiculous and fraught, but it's the policy of the Labor Party. So we've been able to invest money into that space, Mr Speaker. We have been able to deal with protections at our borders because we don't just worry about drugs coming across our borders. We are worried about gun parts and other illicit substances that end up destroying lives of families in our country. Mr Speaker, ASIO is dealing with an unprecedented threat when it comes to foreign interference. We've got firms that are being targeted, Mr Speaker, for their intellectual property. Those solicitors who are doing work for companies who are seeking contracts overseas are being their systems are being attacked. And, Mr Speaker, as we know, the AFP and ASIO are dealing with the very real threat of terrorism, like any other Western democracy. Through their work, we've been able to disrupt 16 attempted terrorist attacks in our country. And, Mr Speaker, it doesn't stop there. The Home Affairs portfolio also has responsibility for cyber security. We want to make sure that families, and in particular kids, are safe online. You can only do it if the budget is back in black and you can afford to invest with certainty in these areas.
The member for Franklin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why has the Prime Minister denied cutting $1.2 billion from aged care when that's exactly what he did in his 2016-17 budget?
Oh, come on.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, this is on a repeat cycle, Mr Speaker. We dealt with these matters before the last election, where we made it very clear that the budget that we have been handing down has been increasing funding for aged care by $1 billion every year, Mr Speaker. Now, that may be of no interest to the member who's asked the question to actually go and check on the facts, but one thing I have learnt from this opposition, Mr Speaker, whenever they come to this dispatch box and start spurting these allegations and these false claims around, Mr Speaker, you can never take them at their word.
The member for Franklin seeking to table
a document.
I just need to call you first.
Sorry.
Is that okay? Member for Franklin wishing to table a document.
I do indeed, Mr Speaker.
Well, you need to say what the document
I
is.
seek leave to table a document, the budget papers from 2016-17 to show the
No, just the Leader of the House can... No, you can resume your seat. We don't table documents that are already papers of the House. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister update the House on how the stability and certainty of the Morrison government's strong budget is bolstering Australia's defence capabilities?
And I call the Minister for Defence Industry. Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Boothby. And I'd like to also acknowledge her strong commitment to the South Australian defence industry. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's strong budget is delivering more jobs and opportunities for small business in the defence industry and also for bolstering our defence capability. Mr Speaker, I'm extremely proud to have led a record delegation of Australian businesses at the Defence and Security Equipment International Trade Show in London last week. Australia had 61 exhibitors there last week as part of Team Defence Australia, showing off their expertise in one of the biggest defence exports events on the world calendar. For us, this event is all about backing Aussie businesses, especially those small and emerging businesses, Mr Speaker, to generate those new export opportunities, creating more investment and securing jobs at home and abroad. And that's what you get, Mr Speaker, when you've got a strong budget. That's how you can support your small businesses. Mr Speaker, Team Defence Australia did us proud, and I want to put on record my thanks for the way that they magnificently showcased Australian businesses on the world stage. They showed that Australian innovation is right up there with the world's best, and can I tell you, the whole world was watching very closely the Australian delegation in London. Members of the House may have also seen a report on Channel 9 Sunday night which showed examples of Aussie ingenuity from companies such as Defentex, who are based in Melbourne. Defentex was one of the 13 companies that I announced was receiving support from the Morrison government to help them grow under our defence export grant process. Another exhibitor is the Craig International Ballistics from the Gold Coast, from the electorate of Fadden, also received funding to help them to become export ready. And I also announced when I was there Defence Innovation Hub funding for Eclipse, who are based here in Canberra, Mr Speaker. And I was also there for the signing of a $15 million defence industry deal between German giant Rheinmetall and Sydney defence business Thomas Global, which will create up to 20 new jobs in Western Sydney. Mr Speaker, the funding support and also the signing of that deal highlights my priority for the defence industry portfolio. This is all about helping small businesses to be a key part of the Morrison government's $200 billion investment in defence capability. The London Trade Show, Mr Speaker, demonstrated that the Australian defence companies are on the world's radar. Mr Speaker, all of this is possible. All of this is possible because our government is delivering a strong and stable government. The Morrison government is backing small businesses and is on the side of Aussie workers. Thank you.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that last financial year 16,000 older Australians died while waiting for their approved home care package?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of the biggest challenges facing this country and its budget into the future is funding the provision of in-home aged care services. And in recent budgets, we've increased the number of places by over 20,000. I'll ask the Health Minister to come and add further to this answer. But the reason that more Australians are choosing to receive that care at home is because they want the choice to do that. And this is an important choice, to be able to stay at home and receive the care that they want to do amongst their loved ones, to be able to spend birthdays and family gatherings together at their home. And that's why our top priority when it comes to aged care is increasing the number of in-home aged care places, which we are doing, Mr Speaker. Now, the only way you can do that, Mr Speaker, the only way you can do it, Mr Speaker, is by ensuring you maintain a strong budget. And that's what you must do, and that's what our government is doing, Mr Speaker. When you can manage money, you can look those in the eye who are looking for those in-home aged care places. You can tell them that the number of in-home aged care places is increasing as it is under this government, and you can promise to deliver on that because you know how to manage money. I'll ask the Minister for Health to add to the answer.
And the Minister for
Thanks
Health.
very much, Mr Speaker, and to the Prime Minister. I can confirm that the latest figures available only today are in advance on what I provided in consideration in detail last week. Last week, I informed the House that we had increased from 60,000 home care packages when we came to government to a projected 124,000 for the last financial year. In fact, the figures available just today are 125,000, or an increase of over 25,000 places and 25% in 1 year. That is potentially one of the largest increases in home care places, both in terms of raw numbers and in percentage, in Australian history. In addition to that, what I can also say is that we are now projected to increase to 157,000 places by 2022-23. So that is a 161% increase in home care places on our watch in our time. I can also inform the House that when one views the ALP's alternative budget, as they seek to be an alternative government, there was zero funding. Zero funding in the election budget proposed by the ALP because they could not afford, despite $387 billion in taxes, they could not afford to add one home care place.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the minister update the House on how the stability and certainty of the Morrison government's strong budget is supporting local schools, particularly in my electorate of Curtin?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Curtin for her question, and I know she's a passionate advocate for the 29 government, 9 Catholic and 14 independent schools in her electorate. And can I just, on indulgence, Mr Speaker, welcome St Joseph's from Penshurst from my electorate, who are here today as well, and say a big hello to them. Just to give you a sense, they've travelled 11 hours by bus to get to Parliament House yesterday. They've had a full day here as part of the PACER program. It's a wonderful program. I know it's enjoyed the cooperation from both sides of the House, and it's wonderful to see St Joseph here today with us. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is providing a record $310 billion for schools right across Australia. That's an increase of 62% per student. It's $18.7 billion last year, $19.9 billion this year, $21.4 billion next year and $22.9 billion the year after. Spending's growing fastest for state schools, around 6.4% per student each year from 2019 to 2023, compared to per-student growth of 4.9% for the non-government sector. But it's just not money that we're about on this side of the House. We also want to make sure that that money is well spent, that it leads to better results and better outcomes. And that's why I'm pleased to inform the House that Education Council—
The Minister resume his seat. The member for Sydney.
Well, just on a matter of relevance, Mr Speaker, the member for Curtin asked specifically about schools in Curtin, and Curtin schools would have been $20.9 million better off under Labor in the first 3 years of the Labor government.
Member for Sydney is warned. Members on both sides. The member for Sydney is warned, and I'm just going to make a point. The question didn't mention alternative policies. Yeah, but now that you've raised it, if they are mentioned, there won't be a point of order raised because you can only raise one. The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I'll just remind the member for Sydney that we won the election. So, at Education Council on Friday, there were three very important reforms that we discussed. One is that we want every student in Australia to have a unique student identifier number. Two, we want to be able to map their progress every year to make sure that they're getting 12 months of learning. And thirdly, we're going to put in place a National Evidence Institute so that we've got the evidence that we need to make sure that teachers—
Minister will pause. The member for Sydney will leave under 94A. The minister will continue.
Because we want to make sure that all schools have the information that they need to improve student outcomes and improve student performances. We want to make sure teachers know what is the latest information they need to get the best outcomes and the best results for the students that they teach. This side of the House is focused on delivering more money for education, but also making sure that that money leads to better outcomes and better results for students, like at St Joseph's in Penshurst.
The member for Franklin again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why are there now 129,000 older Australians waiting for their home care package, even though the packages have been approved?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I refer the member to the previous answer from both myself and the Minister for Health, and I will state again that this is one of the biggest priorities of increasing the number of in-home aged care places for my government, Mr Speaker, and we will continue to make gains in this area. And I look forward to the future statements of the government to build on those statements that we have already made, which have increased the number of places, particularly for those on level 4 packages. And the reason you can do that, Mr Speaker, is because you manage a strong budget and you can keep adding places. But I do pick up the point that the Minister for Health made, that at the last election, despite $387 billion of higher taxes, they could not find $1 extra to create one extra in-home aged care place, Mr Speaker. $387 billion of higher taxes, and even then they couldn't fund these essential services. Yet on our side of the House, we've been increasing those places for in-home aged care by getting the budget in order, by ensuring that we control what we spend so we can spend it on the priorities. And one of my government's priorities, and big priorities, Mr Speaker, is to ensure that we deliver even more in-home aged care places to deal with this issue. And if the Health Minister would like to add, he should feel free to do so.
That's all right. No,
Minister for Health.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister and the Speaker. I'm also delighted to inform the House that, in fact, there has been a 7% reduction in the waiting list in the last 3 months alone. In the last 3 months, a 7% reduction. And that follows from a 25% increase in home care places over the course of the last year. So those two things are directly related. An increase in home care places because the budget can afford it, a decrease in those waiting times of 7% and waiting list of 7%, which we are informing the House of just today.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how a strong budget creates stability and certainty for Australians relying on life-changing medicine, including those living with leukaemia and opioid addiction?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Higgins, who comes to this place with one of the most distinguished medical careers of anybody who has ever graced the House of Representatives, having been a medical researcher, having been a paediatrician at national level. There are many people on both sides who come with great medical careers, but hers is one of the finest. One of the things that she has reminded me of recently is that as a paediatrician, she knew in 2011 many patients and parents who were unable to receive the medicine Symbicort despite the fact that it had been approved by the PBAC and a pricing agreement had been reached with the government. And the reason why this medicine for severe asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was not available was because the then government ran out of money and refused to list it on the PBS. As a consequence, her patients, real patients as a paediatrician with whom she had to deal with on a frequent basis, were unable to access that medicine. Fortunately, this latest round includes a new medicine for COPD, which is being listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. It also includes other very important medicines, such as Buvidal. Buvidal is a medicine which is being made available to help people who have opioid addiction get themselves off that opioid addiction. It's a substitute and it's a pathway for people to reduce, eliminate and ultimately overcome opioid addiction. It has potentially an impact for 110,000 Australians who face this catastrophic condition, and we'll be making it available on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme for free, which is something we do because this will ultimately save lives and protect lives. In addition to that, we are also making a medicine available for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, in particular for patients who have Philadelphia chromosome positive indications. This medicine, Sprycel, would otherwise cost over $50,000. And I had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting Michael Clout. Michael Clout in 2011 was given only a brief period to live. He was able to access Sprycel through clinical trials and subsequently through compassionate access. This medicine, which he would never have been able to have afforded, he said, on his own, has now been made available to all other patients in Australia with this particular variation of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It's now on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. It's available to patients. It's about saving lives and protecting lives, which is ultimately what you can only do when you have a budget and the capacity to pay for it.
The member for Cooper.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. How many registered aged care facilities do not have a registered nurse on site 24 hours a day?
The Prime Minister has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question, and I'd be happy to take that on notice and report back to her.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Will the Minister update the House how the stability and certainty of the Morrison government's strong budget is supporting the rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme?
The Minister for Government Services and the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Barara for his question and his deep interest in the 1,535 participants of the NDIS in his electorate and over 700 providers. The great thing about a strong economy and a dividend from it is you're actually able to deliver services that matter to Australians. And the NDIS is a great national endeavour, and this Morrison government is backing in those with disability, their family and carers, and we are absolutely and utterly committed to delivering the NDIS. Under this government, the NDIS will always be fully funded, always have the money available, and will always support those with disability. It's important to note this is a world-first, once-in-a-generation reform. It's frankly the biggest since Medicare and will support up to 500,000 Australians within the next 5 years. It's something that we as a parliament should hope to be seen and embraced as a truly bipartisan initiative for the benefit of all Australians. There are right now 300,000 Australians enjoying the benefits of the NDIS, and something we should celebrate is there are 100,000 Australians receiving a service for the very first time. And member for Barara, that includes 554 of your constituents who are receiving a service for the first time in their life, and that is something this parliament together should celebrate. Funding for the NDIS, like any demand-driven program, is revised at every budget update to reflect the latest estimates. But building a strong budget is key, because that enables us to make the critical investments we need to make. Earlier this year, we announced significant pricing increases, so from 1 July this year, an additional $1.6 billion is being provided into the market for 1920 to encourage sustainability and innovative services to assist not just the participants, the member for Barawa's seat, but participants in everyone's seat across the country. Over the next 3 years, we'll invest $398 million into information linkages and capacity-building programs. At the very last meeting of all ministers across the country, we agreed to put in $90 million to deal with and solve some of the interfaces at a health level, and in a few weeks' time we'll gather the DRC ministers again to tackle justice and mental health issues. Delivering this groundbreaking reform to improve outcomes for Australians with significant and permanent disability is an absolute and utter priority for the Morrison government, and I know it's a real priority for the parliament.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Royal Commission into Aged Care has heard that in the weeks before Earlhaven suddenly closed, the government knew that 50% of residents were regularly physically restrained and 71% were chemically restrained. Does he agree with the Commission this knowledge should have raised alarm bells and that there should have been a clinical team down there the next day? Does he agree this was a profound failure of the government's regulatory system?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. When I initiated the Royal Commission into Aged Care, Mr Speaker, the reason I did so is because I wanted to know and I wanted to ensure that all Australians had the light shone on our aged care system and to identify whatever failings there were there and whatever horror stories there were there. And I told Australians at the time that they needed to be prepared for some very difficult information to come back from that Aged Care Royal Commission. Now, what I propose to do, Mr Speaker, is I propose to let the Royal Commission do its job, to compile its evidence, to prepare its recommendations. There will be an interim report which will be handed down shortly and will deal with any response that is required at that time. And then we will deal with the recommendations that come from any ultimate report. And, Mr Speaker, I note the constant interjections that are coming from those members opposite. I am simply saying that the Aged Care Royal Commission, when I announced it, and I commend the former opposition leader and the member for Maribyrnong, who gave bipartisan support to this Aged Care Royal Commission, which was the right thing to do, and we, Mr Speaker, will apply ourselves to listening carefully to the outcomes of this Aged Care Royal Commission, Mr Speaker, and then we will tend to the issues that are raised in it. But you will only be able to do that when you can do it from a position of budget strength. We take these issues incredibly seriously. The reports that are coming through from the Aged Care Royal Commission are very disturbing, Mr Speaker, and if I wasn't prepared to hear these stories, I would have never called the Royal Commission that ensured that these measures and these instances could be brought to light. So, Mr Speaker, I am prepared for this Aged Care Royal Commission that I initiated to be able to look into these matters, Mr Speaker, and report to the government, and so the government can take the action as we should and as we will.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is for the Minister representing the Minister for Families and Social Services. Will the Minister update the House on how the stability and certainty of the Morrison government's strong budget is supporting the delivery of social services in Australia?
The Minister representing the Minister for Family and Community Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson, who has a very strong commitment to seeing that people in her electorate and around Australia who are entitled to the support of the social services system receive that support, and that can only happen thanks to the stability and certainty of the strong budget that the Morrison government has delivered. Mr Speaker, over 5 million people depend on social services for their primary source of income, some 2.5 million people on the age pension and people also on a New Start, disability support pension and many other working age income support benefits. There are also many others who depend in part on benefits delivered through the social services system, such as the family tax benefit. And indeed, Mr Speaker, social security and welfare this year will comprise some $180 billion of expenditure, more than a third of the entire Commonwealth budget. Now, we can deliver this support because we have a strong budget. Every dollar which is paid to somebody under the social services and welfare budget is a dollar that has to be collected from another Australian in tax. So it's very important that our commitments are sustainable. Our promise to the Australian people is that if you meet the eligibility conditions, then you're able to receive a payment. But if the social services and welfare system is not sustainable, then you potentially have a problem. Under the previous government, Mr Speaker, social security and welfare expenditure was growing at roughly twice the rate of tax revenue. That is not a sustainable position. Under this government, we've got that under control, and the rate of growth of tax revenue now exceeds the rate of growth of welfare expenditure, and that means if, as an Australian, you are entitled to receive a benefit, then you can be confident that when you turn up to claim that benefit to which you are entitled, the government is able to pay that. It's a very important proposition. We've made it our priority, Mr Speaker, to get people off of welfare and into the workforce. 1.4 million jobs created since we came to government. There are 230,000 fewer people of working age on welfare as at June 2018 compared to 4 years earlier. In fact, the level of working age population on welfare at 14.3% is at its lowest level in 30 years. We are making sure that welfare is available for those who need it. We are helping those who are not in work to return to the workforce, and it all depends on a strong budget giving stability and certainty to underpin our social services system.
The member for Franklin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What is the Prime Minister's response to the Council assisting the Royal Commission into Aged Care, who says the accreditation system does not adequately ensure good quality of care and good quality of life for the residents of aged care facilities, and that the government's regulatory approach leaves at risk the very people whom the system is intended to protect?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. These are very important questions, and they go to the reason why we did call the Royal Commission, as the Prime Minister indicated. In particular, he called a commission knowing that there would be stories that would shock Australians, and I would give the context that the commission, of course, followed the Oakton tragedy and crisis in South Australia, a South Australian state-run facility which led to some of the most shocking scenes in aged care and indeed institutional care in post-war Australian history. That was why the Prime Minister called this. But in addition to the Commission itself, and we urge the Commission to continue their work and to go fearlessly with their work, and I have to say that the Commission has done that so far. But as the Prime Minister said at the time, we would continue to get on with the job of regulating and safeguarding Australians whilst the Commission carried out its work. In particular, that was why we appointed the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. Janet Anderson is doing that role and has been inspecting around the country. Her and her team, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner, have at the same time as the Royal Commission has been going on, inspecting and where breaches have been found, calling out and highlighting any inadequacies. We do this for the very reason that we believe that every Australian in aged care deserves to be protected, deserves to be supported and deserves to have their safety guarded each and every day. In addition to that, in relation to Earlhaven, the Aged Care Minister, Senator Colbeck, appointed Kate Carnell to conduct an inquiry, and the Carnell inquiry is going on as we speak. I would also note that one of the proprietors, Mr Miller, has failed to appear before an inquiry, and I would urge Mr Miller to appear before all inquiries as soon as he is fit to do so. Now, I have to say that there can be no excuse for any of the proprietors to appear before the relevant inquiries, whether it's the Queensland State Parliament, the Royal Commission or the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. And so my message to Mr Miller is appear before the inquiry, fulfil your duty, explain your failures, apologise for your failures and stand up and be counted for the failures on your watch in your time. That's why we've appointed Kate Carnell, that's why we've appointed Janet Anderson, and that's why we've appointed a Royal Commission to do what no previous government has ever done before.
I'm going to call the Leader of the Opposition. I just might, if the House doesn't mind, I might just sort of deal with this confusion that's arising at this time in question time. I've tried to sort of deal with it before. When the call allocates, as you all know, when the government side doesn't jump, my responsibility is to call the first person who I call the person I think jumped first. In this case, it was the Leader of the Opposition. I do need to make clear the practice is might pay the member for Kennedy just to listen until I've finished. I listen to him a lot, so. And in anticipation of this, I've got the practice open at pages 502 and 3, and I'd ask people confused about this matter to familiarise themselves with it. It makes it very clear. With respect to independent questions, the practice has been they're asked in proportion to their numbers, so that's certainly happening already with that early question. Then if one side doesn't jump, my responsibility is to allocate the call to the person I think jumped first. In this case, it was the Leader of the Opposition. If it had not been, I'm making very clear, I would have called the Leader of the Opposition anyway, because page 502 of practice makes clear that preference is given on the government side to the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister, and on the opposition side to the Leader of the Opposition or the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. So that's the practice that's there. I don't propose to deviate from it. The allocation of the call is something I do. It's not a ruling, by the way. And that's also very clear. So I'm going to call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is also addressed to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister accept that a combination of deep cuts and the government's deregulation obsession have left older Australians in care vulnerable to abuse and to neglect? Why is the Prime Minister denying basic facts, failing to be upfront and failing to take responsibility in the 7th year of the 3rd term of this government, even for the most vulnerable Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I don't accept the Leader of the Opposition's characterisation of this matter at all. Mr Speaker, as I responded earlier in answer to a question, the reason I initiated the Royal Commission into aged care, Mr Speaker, is because I wanted to know and I wanted to be—
Members on my left. Members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
I wanted to assure Australians, those who are making one of the most difficult decisions they have about when they put family members into care. That could be a loved partner, husband, wife. It could be an uncle, a father, a mother. Mr Speaker, I'm endeavouring to answer the question. And those opposite seeking to just frankly not show the courtesy to which this issue deserves respect, Mr Speaker. I've been asked the question and I'm answering the question earnestly on a very serious issue, and I would ask them to calm themselves.
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call. Member for McEwen. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, no, I don't accept the Leader of the Opposition's characterisation of this matter. That is why the government increases funding for aged care every single year. It is why, Mr Speaker, the government wants to ensure that the results of this Royal Commission are fully implemented, Mr Speaker, as we work through the issues that are raised and to ensure that we get to the bottom of the care issues that are so central. Now, Mr Speaker, I am going to respect and trust the work of the Royal Commission that I initiated, and I would ask those opposite to adopt a similar position.
The member for Kennedy.
Treasurer, Isn't monetary policy proving ineffective? Interest rates down from 3.5 to almost zero, yet there's negligible movement in the macro statistics so beloved of government and public officials. In reality land, except for the suits, isn't most of Australia on struggle street? Treasurer, isn't this the historic moment for fiscal action? Not to assess, not to process, not to accept the stagnation imposed by Queensland's worst ever leaders. Surely petrol security screams Hell's Gates. 7% of Australia's fuel, ethanol, clean and forever. Copper String and Galilee Rail explodes employment and prosperity. Treasurer, will you get the shovel and join our chain gang?
The member for Kennedy's time has concluded, and the Treasurer has the call to answer those questions.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Kennedy for his question and can inform him that we've got a 10-year, $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure project, including there's been some substantial investments in his electorate. The Mount Isa to Rockhampton corridor upgrade at $190 million, the Tennant Creek to Townsville corridor upgrade of $200 million, the Townsville to Roma corridor upgrade of $100 million, Mr Speaker. There's also the $10 billion Bruce Highway upgrade, the $1.2 billion M1 Pacific Highway upgrade across Queensland. Mr Speaker, we are investing significantly in infrastructure. Now, the member for Kennedy raised the issue of the Galilee Basin. We recognise the Galilee Basin is an important resource and will help create many jobs in that region and beyond. We also acknowledge that the railway line will be an important infrastructure project. And I say to the member for Kennedy, unlike those opposite, we will not say one thing to the baristas of Batman and another to the miners of Mackay, Mr Speaker. We will speak up for those people who work in the resources project, work in the resources sector, acknowledging that their jobs are important and that their contribution to the Australian economy is important too.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Water Resources, Drought, Rural Finance, Natural Disaster and Emergency Management. Will the minister update the House on what actions the Morrison government is taking to ensure the safety and support of those communities who are sadly affected by tragic bushfires, including on the Gold Coast?
The Minister for Emergency Management.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the honourable member for her question and her interest in her native Gold Coast, and where the Prime Minister and I and the member for Wright visited last week and announced extra support, income support for those people that have been impacted by this fire event. And today I had the honour this morning to visit Stanthorpe and my own electorate to see a community that has galvanised and put its arms around those that have lost. And I've been able to partner with the Queensland Government in increasing our Category B payments for freight relief and also concessional loans for repairs of construction and also further freight. And this builds on what we've already announced in partnership with the state government in terms of income of $900 per family instantly. As soon as these fires took place, the Queensland Government and the federal government worked hand in hand. We made sure that those people who were impacted were not out of pocket. We've also got grants available for household goods and for the rebuilding of their properties. And we stand ready with the Queensland Government when they make further application for assistance. But what was sobering, Mr Speaker, this morning was when I met with the Assistant Commissioner Megan Stifler, who ran operations, and the stark reminder of her assessment the night those fires started. They made an assessment that there would be fatalities. The catastrophic nature of the fire that took place around Stanthorpe and Applethorpe meant that there was very little that they thought that they could do, that there would be fatalities. Proudly, because of the meticulous planning of those men and women, both professional and volunteers, had put in place, meant that not one life has been lost. Homes have been lost. And I met Mr and Mrs Borzali today, and to the day that they lost their house, it marked 50 years since they emigrated from France to Australia. Yet despite the pain and anguish that they and their family felt, all they were concerned about, all that they were proud about, was that they had a small-town community that put their arms around them. and they had firemen and women that stood there with them and tried to protect their homes and their properties. Like Pedro. Pedro is the captain of the Rural Fire Brigade at Stanthorpe, just a knockabout bloke. He and his battalion worked for over 24 hours trying to save their community. Ordinary Australians doing extraordinary things. We should be proud of the fact that in these darkest days, average Australians become great Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition has just indicated he wants to very briefly on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do want to associate Labor with the remarks of the Minister, congratulate him on the nature of those remarks, but more importantly, on behalf of our side, join with your side of the House in congratulating all those men and women, whether they be paid, but particularly those volunteers who are going out there and helping their fellow Australians at this difficult time.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.